The prairie stretched wide and silent, broken only by the groan of wind against the fence posts. On that land lived a man hardened by years of labor, a rancher whose face bore the lines of sun, storms, and sorrow. His back was strong, his hands rough as leather, yet his heart had long been buried beneath the soil of grief. Once love had lived in his house, warm laughter at dawn, a soft voice waiting by the fire. But time had stolen it away. Whether by sickness or heartbreak, no one dared to ask. They only knew the rancher had been left hollow. He kept his land, his cattle, and his pride, but little else. Each day followed the same rhythm. Sunrise, work until sweat soaked his shirt, then return to a house where silence pressed against the walls. His meals were plain, hard bread, black coffee, sometimes a slab of meat if he remembered to cook. He ate quickly, as though chewing through duty rather than food. There were no prayers, no voices at the table, only the scrape of cutlery against wood. He never lit the second lamp in the house. Why waste the oil when there was no one to sit across from him? One chair stayed empty, always empty. Dust settled on shelves, cobwebs lingered in corners, and though the ranch itself was kept in order, the home within its walls stood lifeless. Neighbors called him steady, reliable, a man who carried his pain without complaint. But behind those weathered eyes lived a truth he never admitted. He had buried love so deep he believed it could never be dug up again. Better to let it lie, like a grave unmarked, than risk the ache of losing it twice. And so he lived, not truly alive, not truly dead, caught in an exile of his own making. His world was measured by fences, cattle, and silence. He thought nothing could ever break it. But fate has a way of sending tremors into the coldest earth. And soon the footsteps of a widow and the cry of her child would rattle the walls of his solitude. On the edge of the same town lived a woman who knew loss just as deep as the rancher, though hers carried a smaller heartbeat in her arms. She was a widow, her husband taken by misfortune before life had given them much chance to live it. What he left behind was not wealth, not land, but a child, an infant whose cries echoed through her nights, whose tiny hands clutched her as if she were the only anchor left in a cruel and drifting world. The widow's clothes bore the wear of poverty, patched hems, faded fabric, her shoes had holes in the soles, and her shoulders often ached from carrying both child and burden. Yet her eyes, tired as they were, still carried a quiet fire. She was not made for surrender. Her only true skill was cooking. She had learned it from her mother before marriage, stretched it through hunger when her husband was alive, and clung to it now as the last means to survive. She could make a loaf of bread from the barest scraps of flour, brew soup from bones and roots, and fill a room with the smell of life even when her own heart felt like ashes. But in town, whispers followed her like shadows. Who would hire a woman with a child strapped to her hip, they said. A kitchen needs two hands free. A rancher won't stand the noise of a baby. Some said she should give the child away, others that she should remarry quick, as though survival were simply choosing another man. She heard them all, every cruel murmur, but each time she looked down at the baby's face, eyes round, trusting, filled with the innocence she herself had long lost, she found the strength to keep walking. The child was both her greatest burden and her greatest light, the reason she pushed forward when her body begged her to rest. She went from door to door, offering her service. Most turned her away with polite words that barely hid disdain. But she did not break. Hunger gnawed, loneliness cut, yet she kept moving. Because somewhere in this wide, heartless land, she believed there must be a place where her hands, her food, and her love could belong. And fate, though late, was already drawing her path toward the rancher, whose heart had forgotten how to beat. The rancher first saw her coming up the long dirt path, a bundle of cloth in her arms, her figure small against the endless prairie. She looked worn, but she walked with her back straight, her steps firm. When she reached his porch, she adjusted the child on her hip, and knocked her knuckles soft against the weathered wood. He opened the door, wary eyes taking her in. He'd expected another drifter asking for coin. not a widow with a baby staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. "I can cook," she said, her voice steady though the wind tugged at her shawl. "All I ask is work and a roof. I'll earn my keep." The rancher frowned. He had no need for strangers in his home, and certainly not the crying of a child echoing through his walls. Yet hunger for warmth, the kind only a meal cooked with care could bring, made him pause. Against his better judgment, he gave a slow nod. "You'll try for a week," he muttered, stepping aside. Inside she wasted no time. She set the baby down in a cradle basket she carried, then moved to the kitchen like she belonged there. Her hands moved quickly, mixing, kneading, stirring. Before long the cabin filled with scents the rancher had almost forgotten: bread rising, stew simmering, herbs softening the bitterness of boiled meat. When he sat at the table that night, the food tasted like memory, like something he hadn't dared crave. For the first time in years, the silence at supper wasn't hollow. It was alive with the scrape of spoons and the soft babble of a child, but tension remained. The rancher sat stiff, fork in hand, his eyes flicking toward the baby each time it let out a cry. The wail seemed to split the fragile peace he kept, rattling against the emptiness he had long guarded. He muttered that the child was a distraction, a weight. The widow didn't answer his complaints. She only rocked her baby gently, humming low until the cries softened. Then she returned to her work, steady and unshaken. And though he wouldn't admit it, the rancher ate every bite that night, more than he had in months. Something had shifted, even if both were too proud or too wounded to name it. Word in a small town travels quicker than wind through canyon passes. It wasn't long before tongues wagged about the widow and her child living under the rancher's roof. At the trading post, men leaned on counters and whispered. Women shook their heads as they packed flour and salt. "She's after his money," they said. "A lonely man with land. Of course she set her sights on him. She'll never fit there. A woman with a baby doesn't belong on a ranch. Mark my words, she'll bleed him dry, then leave." The rancher heard the whispers himself on his rare trips into town. Each word was like grit under his skin. Pride stiffened his jaw, but the doubt found its way in. Had he invited trouble into his home? Was he letting sentiment cloud the cold, hard truth that had kept him alive all these years? Trust no one, need no one. Back at the ranch, storms gathered, not just in the sky, but inside his heart. One night, as rain lashed the windows and wind clawed at the shutters, the baby's cries pierced the air with a feverish pitch. The child burned hot with sickness, face flushed, tiny chest heaving with effort. The widow stayed by the cradle, her hands trembling as she sponged the baby's brow. She sang softly, her voice breaking, though she would not let herself weep. The rancher stood in the doorway, muscles taut, his mind wrestling with memories he had buried. Memories of another sickbed, another life slipping through his fingers. While he stood helpless, fear gnawed at him. Caring again meant risking again, and risk meant pain. His instinct screamed to retreat into the silence he knew best, to shut out the sound of grief before it could claim him once more. But the sight of her, the widow bent over her child, refusing to yield, holding on with a strength born of desperation, pulled at him like nothing had in years. He brought water, gathered wood for the fire, even sat through the long hours of night, as the child whimpered and coughed. Every cry stabbed through his armor, reopening the old wound he had sworn would never bleed again. The storm outside raged, but the greater storm was within him. For the first time in years, he was no longer a man apart. He was tangled in the fragile fight for life, bound to a widow's courage and a baby's breath. And in that long night of doubt, something dangerous stirred, the possibility of hope. The fever broke after days of restless nights, but the baby's strength did not return all at once. He whimpered often, reaching out for comfort with small trembling hands. One night, the widow, exhausted from sleepless vigil, slumped into a chair, her head heavy against the table. The child stirred in its cradle, crying softly. The rancher, who had been pacing the floor with unease, moved before he could stop himself. He lifted the baby, awkward at first, his calloused hands clumsy against fragile skin. The weight was so slight, yet it felt like he was holding the world. The baby blinked up at him, dark eyes wide and unguarded. There was no suspicion in them, no memory of grief or betrayal, only a pure trust that pierced through the walls he had built around his heart. In those eyes, the rancher saw something he thought had been buried forever, the chance to love and be loved without fear. For a moment the cabin was silent, except for the baby's soft breaths. The rancher's chest tightened, not from pain, but from something far more dangerous, tenderness. His lips pressed together, his eyes burning with an ache that was not sorrow but longing. Across the room, the widow stirred, watching him through half-lidded eyes. She saw the way his rough hands cradled the child, not with hesitation now, but with a reverence he hadn't shown to anything in years. She saw his shoulders relax, his expression soften, and in that fragile picture, she caught a glimpse of a man she could begin to trust. From that night on, the air inside the cabin shifted. The meals once eaten in silence began to stretch longer as the widow told small stories, and the rancher listened without scorn. Sometimes, against his own nature, he even answered. The baby's laughter, light and bubbling, filled the spaces where silence used to choke. Bread was passed around with hands that no longer shook. The stew pot became a center of warmth, its scent mingling with the sound of voices, two adults and a child, weaving something that felt alarmingly close to family. The rancher found himself lingering at the table after meals, watching the widow laugh softly as the baby reached for her hair. He felt the old emptiness loosening its grip, replaced by something fragile but alive. The house, once nothing more than walls and wood, was beginning to breathe again, and with every shared glance, every sound of the baby's innocent joy, the rancher's heart inched closer to a truth he had long denied. He was no longer alone. The weeks rolled into months, and what began as necessity had grown into something neither the widow nor the rancher had dared to imagine. He no longer saw her as a hired hand. Her presence had become the rhythm of his days. The meals she cooked weren't just food, they were a bond, a warmth that carried him through each night. The baby's laughter was no longer a disruption, but a sound that softened the hardest hours of labor. One evening, after a long day of work, the rancher came in from the fields. Dust clung to his clothes, the sun painting his skin in the amber of dusk. He found the widow at the table, the baby in her lap, spooning broth with a patience born of love. He stood there for a moment, watching, feeling something inside him press against the last of his walls. He sat down slowly, and without thinking, reached for the baby. The child grasped his finger, eyes sparkling with trust, and in that moment, the words came, not grand, not rehearsed, but heavy with truth. "He's mine now," the rancher said quietly. The widow's breath caught. She looked at him, tears welling, the weight of her wandering and struggle lifting in an instant. In those 4 words, he had given her more than safety. He had given her belonging, not just to him, but to this place, this life, this family that had been forged from emptiness. The following days, the gossip in town softened. People saw the widow and her child riding beside the rancher, their faces steady, their bond undeniable. Whispers of doubt could not stand against the simple, unshakable sight of a man who had once been broken now standing tall with his family at his side. Back at the cabin, the nights glowed brighter. The table, once a grave of silence, now carried laughter, stories, and the music of a child's joy. Bread was broken not out of duty, but shared as love. The oil lamp flickered warmly, painting their faces in gold, sealing the picture of a home reborn. The rancher had buried his heart long ago, convinced it would never rise again. Yet a widow's cooking, and a baby's eyes had unearthed it, breathing life into ground he thought forever barren. He was no longer a man apart. He was husband, he was father, he was home.